mechanism and sets up offences there.
The Honourable Marianne Street.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman. I wonder, Mr Chair, I suppose I'm raising it as a point of order. Can I just clarify for a moment, are we dealing with Part 2 and Schedules 1 and 2
yes.
or just Part...
and 3, Schedules 1 to 3.
Schedules 1, 2 and 3.
Yes.
Thank you very much indeed. That may make a difference to what I say. Thank you very much. Mr Chairman, this is the part of the bill in Part 2. Subpart 1 deals with offences and penalties and Subpart 2 deals with other matters. Before I begin on this, and I want also to refer to the Minister's SOP, which comes in on Clause 33 in due course. However, I just wanted to recognise the contribution from Eric Roy earlier, which I found very helpful, particularly with some of those clauses in Part 1 which had raised questions. And so I thank the member for that. But it did leave me with some more questions, which are now exacerbated by Part 2, because this is the bit that deals with, in the first instance, offences and penalties. And it seems to me that if this bill if the resolution to some of the difficulties between hunting organisations and the Department of Conservation and so on had been resolved through a different measure, that is not a statute setting up a game animal council on its own, then some of the provisions in Part 2 would not be necessary either. Certainly offences need to be established, and that could easily have been done, I think, under the wild animal control legislation to which I've referred previously, and being done in a way that was cooperative and came out of an advisory committee established under that legislation rather than this. So while I recognise that offences and penalties are necessary, the thing I'm questioning in this part, Mr Chairman, is that this entire process and this special bureaucracy that's being established to implement it would not have been necessary in this form had the Minister chosen to take more notice of the submissions that were put in by submitters to the Select Committee, or had chosen to take more notice of the regulatory impact statement written by the Department of Conservation. So, Mr Chairman, this really goes back to stage 1 for me, because if these penalties and provisions here and the definitions of a herd of special interest and so on are all essential, then it might have been better to have had it come as recommendations from an advisory council that the Minister could not disestablish under the Wild Animal Act. Mr Chairman, I want to go to another matter, and it's in Schedule 1, and it talks about enforcement officers and honorary enforcement officers. Enforcement officers are clearly appointed within the meaning of the Conservation Act as an enforcement officer for the purposes of this Act, so there will be warranted officers appointed under the Conservation Act to carry out the enforcement functions required under this piece of legislation. It also then talks about the appointment and removal of honorary enforcement officers. Mr Chairman, an honorary enforcement officer here in Schedule 1 says that there's somebody who may be appointed for a term not exceeding 3 years, but may be reappointed they may be removed from office by the Director General of the Department of Conservation if the Director General considers that that person is no longer a fit and proper person. And they may, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I just wish to conclude this point fairly quickly. The Minister may reimburse an honorary enforcement officer for reasonable expenses. This goes back to a theme that is being pursued by this government when it comes to the care and protection of our environment. The Minister has stripped back the Department of Conservation to such an extent that it cannot now even carry out its legal functions. So it cannot preserve and protect and advocate for the environment given the stripping back of the staff of the Department of Conservation. And its answer to that, the Minister's answer to that, has been partnership, has been the words around partnering with volunteers and charitable organisations in order to ensure that our environment can be adequately protected. This is the same Minister who's wanting to get housing on the cheap through giving minuscule amounts of money to third sector organisations in housing provision, and he wants to contract out parts of the functions of the Department of Conservation because it can no longer fulfil those functions because of retrenchments and staffing. And he wants to contract out those functions to volunteers and voluntary and charitable organisations, and so get environmental protection on the cheap. And this is now environmental or game animal enforcement on the cheap with enforcement officers. So I presume that the Minister has in mind that he will give people who volunteer to do this position a cap. They are then at their own resources with this hat on that says Honorary Enforcement Officer. They can then stroll around our environment, ensuring that the provisions of this bill, and particularly the requirements of Part 2 of this bill, are being honoured and are being implemented. So, Mr. Chairman, I worry that this is the same model that is being used in other areas where the government wants to withdraw money that it provides for legitimate and legislated functions, and pass that over to charitable organisations, individuals, and the private sector in some cases, in order to carry out what should be government functions. The Minister should resource this properly if he wants the functions to be carried out adequately. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair.
The question.
Mr. Chair.
I call the Honourable Member Moana Maki.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to begin by focusing on Schedule 1, which is around the role of enforcement officers and honorary enforcement officers under this new Game Animal Council legislation. Because any piece of legislation is only as good as in terms of how well it can be enforced. And so the enforcement and the penalty provisions that are found in Part 2 of this bill will only really have any meaning or any effect if those people who seek to break the law in terms of this Game Animal Council feel that there's an adequate chance that they will be caught in breaching the provisions of this bill. And one of the concerns that we had at Select Committee was really a lack of detail around how many of these enforcement officers we would have. We know that every constable in the New Zealand Police Force will be considered an enforcement officer, but we also know that they have a very large job to do outside of the Game Animal Council bill. The reality is I don't believe that our police force are going to be patrolling dockland as a priority to catch people carrying out illegal hunting or illegal hunting of herds of national significance, unless they've been tipped off that there's something very bad going on. But then the question comes down to who is going to do that day-to-day monitoring that realistically is not going to be carried out by the New Zealand Police Force. And so we have a role of enforcement officers, and then we have what are called honorary enforcement officers. And at Select Committee, our concern was